This episode is brought to you by bewatersmart.info. Is your yard summer strong? A summer strong yard is tough enough to take the heat and still look its best. Here's 2 ways to help. First, replace your thirsty lawn with native and low water use plants and install drip irrigation and high efficiency rotor sprinklers. You'll use less water and have a healthier, happier yard. Second, here's how to help your trees grow strong enough to handle the summer heat. First, check the soil with a moisture meter or screwdriver to see if it's dry. If you need a water, set up a soaker hose or drip irrigation at the outer edges of the tree's branches. Water your trees at least once a month. Find more helpful tips and videos at bewatersmart.info.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. And today I have a guest that I'm quite honored to have on the podcast. Many of you probably listen to her podcast. It's an award-winning radio and podcast called Cultivating Place. And she is an author and educator. She calls herself a plant generalist. So I sort of am the same. So I feel like, ooh, we have something in common. And she has a new book coming out or just came out called We Sow. And it's a very interesting book looking at, as you would expect, seeds, but of course, much more than that. So joining me is Jennifer Jewell. Thank you for being on my podcast.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Marlene. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm excited to chat more.
And you know, we don't live very far from each other.
No,
So
just like as the crow flies, right? We're essentially the same ecosystem, but you get a little bit more of that Delta breeze than I do further north.
I love it when people are even one town from me and they're like, oh, you get the Delta breeze.
Right, exactly.
It does help. It does help on those scorching summer days. But it was fun reading, your book, and it's just all the plants and all the terrain so familiar. And I'm like, I felt like you were writing about my backyard.
Yeah.
So, I always like to start with how people got into gardening. What was their journey? Because sometimes it's a straight line. Most of the time it's not. Most of the time people's lives go every which way. And I know I was born just loving gardening, but a lot of times people didn't come until they're later in life, or they don't really know, or there was one particular instance. But I always like to get people's background to figure out where they're at and where they came from. So where were you born and raised?
I also love these exact questions and stories, Marlene, because I think they tell us so much about how we share our love forward with others who might not have met it, but also reminds us where it comes from in us. It's actually sort of that past, present, future continuum that seed embodies, this idea of where we were inoculated with a gardening love and some of the knowledge that we will, of course, hopefully acquire more of throughout our lives. But I was born to a professional gardening mother. She was a garden designer and floral designer, and she had her own little business at about 8,000 feet in Colorado, and a wildlife biologist father. So from both sides of my parents, in my household of origin, there was a lot of information about plants, about the animals who rely on them, and about the environments in which they are either grown naturally, occur naturally, or are grown in cultivation, from flower gardens to big vegetable gardens to hikes in the Rocky Mountains, identifying the native plants of the region. This was the soil I was germinated in.
So a lot of people, as they're younger, sort of are like push away from what their parents did. But that doesn't sound like your case at all. It sounds like this is a love that you cultivated. And did you continue straight through, or did you go, no, this could always be a hobby. My parents do this. I'm going to do something else.
Right. Well, I went through, which I also find in guests on my program, that there were the middle years, so sort of high school, college, early career, where you just don't have, you're so busy doing like what you need to do to build your life the way you envision it, that there isn't always a lot of time for really intentional cultivation. I I went through high school in a different. I was away at high school at a boarding school, so there wasn't a lot of cultivation for me there. And then I started off school in New York City. And one of the reasons I left school in New York City was I didn't recognize it at the time, but I recognize it now, is I was definitely experiencing, what do they call it? Nature deficit disorder. Like I was depressed, not having enough blue sky, fresh air, and green around me. But then it was in my early career days as a writer and editor that I had the time and a little bit of space to really garden in pots, on my back porch, on my window ledges, but also in a tiny little backyard in a neighborhood of North Seattle. And that is where I went, oh yeah, this is part of who I am. And from there, I started to incorporate it into my actual work life and writing about gardening, interviewing gardeners. And this would have been 1995 to, almost 2007 when we moved to Northern California. And I was writing about gardening in sort of shelter magazines, Gardens Illustrated, House and Garden, and other big names you can recognize. And I did that until about 2007 when I started my first radio program here in Northern California called In a North State Garden.
Okay. So you were a writer first. So that makes me feel, I'm going to say it makes me feel better, because I'm like, wow, you're a phenomenal writer. And I'm like, she just happened to garden and one day go, oh, I'm going to write and this is what comes out. But you have a background in writing and it definitely shows. Because every time I try to write, it's just so like, here are the facts, ma'am. Here it is.
Right.
And then, I read your books and it's flowing and it's beautiful. And it's what gardening is. It's beautiful and it's gentle and it's flowing and it's funny and it's, and I love, but I could never write like that. So I'm glad there are people who can. So
Well,
I appreciate
those kind words, because as anybody who writes knows, and anybody who gardens knows, it's always harder than it looks at its best moments. So a lot harder. So there's a lot of weeding.
Yes, there you go. I guess, quote, editing, weeding. There you go.
Right,
Same
right.
things. So your current book, and has it come out yet? I noticed you were at Annie's Annuals doing the launch.
Yep.
And I was just there yesterday. I missed it, but
oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
So, in fact, I'm not sure when this podcast will air, but you and I are speaking on Monday, September 18th, and it is the day before my delivery date. So tomorrow, September 19th, is publication day for What We Sow. And it's always such a long time getting there. And then when it arrives, you're like, wow, that actually went faster than I thought in the moment. But it's anybody who, has created a garden or had a child or even cared for a pet, let alone a garden, knows that the buildup, the planning and the planting, waiting for everything to actually take on their own lives, it's a lot of work, and it is sometimes painful, and sometimes you just want it done. And tomorrow it launches into the world.
How exciting. So this came about right during COVID, or were you sort of mulling the idea over before COVID?
Well, that is a really good question, right? And it actually is very related to our own germination stories. Like, how did you become a gardener? And when people ask me this question now about What We Sow, the short and quick answer is there was a moment when I was on speaking tour for my first book, The Earth in Her Hands, in early 2020. And I was supposed to be on the road. My partner and I, John, were supposed to be traveling for about 9 weeks. But you guys remember March of 2020. Nothing we had envisioned or planned came true to form at that moment. And we were in New York City, and we knew we had to get home to California. And we also knew we had not planned for our spring garden because we weren't supposed to be home. So one of the things we did while trying to like make sure our children were safe and make sure that we could get airline tickets back home was to start ordering seed, or try to start ordering seed. And over again, we kept getting the messages back from the seed companies we generally used for the seed varieties we liked, out of stock, back ordered, not available. And it was this kind of aha moment of, wait a minute, how can we be out of seed? Like, that is a terrifying thought if you think about it in the most kind of meta way. And that got me thinking about what I myself understood about seed and about seed supply and seed distribution and seed care. So that's the most immediate answer to your question. But when I started to do the research for this book, which is essentially my own journey, refreshing my understanding or completing my own education in how seed is formed biologically, how it is farmed and saved and shared and distributed and cared for or not cared for well in the world, what I realized is that all of this actually goes back to each one of us being lifelong students of seed, whether we know it or not. And I think, when I say to you, what was the first seed you remember like really loving or holding or playing with, or, like blowing that dandelion seed off of that head to make a wish the seed to go out and get it, or playing with acorns in their caps like a little family, or whatever, like maple samaras helicoptering in the air around you. Most people have some early memories of seed. And then, as I looked at my own career, what was clear to me as well was that this had been a line of inquiry of real interest to me, that I had interwoven into everything else I had done. So when I look back at the earth in her hands, I was interviewing and researching women in leadership positions related to horticulture across the globe. There is a whole line of inquiry specifically devoted to women in seed keeping. So that includes like Vandana Shiva out of India, or Cara Larise, who is the executive director of the Organic Seed Alliance. It is Rowan White, who is the founder of Sierra Seeds in our region here, Marlene, but who also is the founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network for the American, I'm going to get this acronym right, the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. The Indigenous Seed Keepers Network sits under that umbrella. And then I looked at my second book, which was Under Western Skies, and there is a whole suite of gardens profiled in that book that are based on seed-grown native plant ecological gardens that are beautiful, right? But they are setting a new standard, or a renewed standard, perhaps, for what good gardening means in our world. So, and then this is such a great question. I just keep going on with it.
Go for it. It's interesting.
When I looked back at the podcast, when my original radio program grew up into the national and international Cultivating Place, I looked back at 2016, my first year of production for the 1 hour show. And I think something like 6 out of the first 15 episodes are devoted to seed, which I thought was like, I hadn't intended it that way necessarily, but to look back, like this was clearly something that was in the back of my own mind as an important sector that I didn't yet know enough about.
So it's fascinating that you were talking about, and just reading through your book when you had that moment when you were ordering seeds and everything was out. I mean, I think it's almost like, I think as a gardener, we all remember when that happened. And for me, it was just, how is that possible? I did it in a, how is that possible? Meaning how many, I'm like, wow, I didn't, I took for granted there was always going to be the
Mhm.
seeds available. And I think that was the eye-opening thing and then I thought, wow, everyone's getting into gardening, but it is true. Seeds are the fundamental, uh, where we get our food from. Without
Mhm.
them, it could be quite scary. I sort of want to pivot because we're talking about, the book is about how important seeds are. And I think even like maybe new gardeners or people who've been gardening for a while still don't really understand the importance of seeds because we
Right.
have such a choice of going and
Right.
buying plants. We have a choice of starting our plants from cuttings. But what is the importance of seeds, especially when it comes to hybrids and continuing the genetics of certain plants?
Right. Well, this is a multifold answer. You think about plant life here on planet Earth, Marlene, and at this point in our evolution and adaptation as humans and plants and animals on this globe, there are about there are different kinds of plants. Some don't produce
Mhm.
seed. Those are the earliest of our plants. About 365 million years ago, those plants figured out ways to adapt and evolve to create seed bearing plants. The earliest were, sort of relatives of our gymnosperms, the conifers, our cone bearing plants, which produce seed and disperse seed in a slightly different way than most of our seed bearing plants. So on the planet right now, 80% of all plant life are seed bearing angiosperms. Those are our flowering seed bearing plants. Pretty much every plant you can think of in your immediate environment, unless it's a fern,
Yeah.
maybe a palm, uh, they are flowering seed bearing plants. 80% of all the plant life on the planet. And a large number of those are our food. And anything that's not our food is most likely food for our food, like the wildlife and domesticated animals that we eat. But interestingly, as well, like you think about this, and I say this in the book because it was sort of an epiphany for me to really put my head around. Like, if you think about the four elements: earth, wind, fire, water, right?
Mhm.
If you don't have seed on our planet today, those four things cannot equal a habitable,
Mhm.
life giving planet for us. Like, you need seed as the fifth element for us to breathe, for us to house ourselves, and for us to eat. So that, like, I was like, wow, right? And
Yeah.
that was part of this primal fear that was triggered in this moment of like, what if we run out of seed?
Mhm.
And so first of all, seed is important because it represents the essence, the beginning point of 80% of all plant life on the planet. But to get to your second question, when we're talking about biodiversity and biodiversity loss on our planet, right? We're talking about 1 million living organisms, plant, animal, being in danger of extinction in the relatively near future, and a huge number having gone extinct and been lost in the last, at least 50 years. The biodiversity of plant life is dependent on seed reproduction. So when you take a plant and you cut a cutting or you divide it from its roots and you now have two plants, you don't genetically have two plants. You actually have two identical plants. So that doesn't add to the genetic biodiversity of our world. It just is like a parallel move
Mhm.
instead of an expansion move. You need the sexual reproduction of pollination in a plant with pollen from another plant to have the sexual reproduction that creates a whole new plant. Now, in some cases, plants that reproduce well from seed without a lot of complicated isolation distances and whatnot, that seed will come true and look a lot like its parent plants. In some cases, the genetic mix-up creates a whole new plant that sort of doesn't look anything like its parents or doesn't look like the parent you wanted it to look like. So But the seed produced has the genetic biodiversity that we want. And this is really important at this exact moment in time in our gardened world. And this is, I think, what you were hoping I would get to, Marlene, is that we are being asked as gardeners writ large to plant as many native plants in our gardens as we can, specifically to help offset this biodiversity loss, to have our gardens serve as refugia for insects and birds and mammals and plant diversity, to be, kind of reintegrating parts of a fragmented ecosystem biodiversity that used to exist wherever our houses now sit. But if all we are doing is getting cloned plants, cuttings, tissue culture divisions from our native plant industry, we are actually contributing to a contracting biodiversity instead of an expanding biodiversity. And that is like a weird thing that we really need to understand as we push for greater biodiversity in our gardens. And we get it by growing our native plants from seed, or our heritage heirloom open pollinated vegetable and fruit and flower seeds that have been passed for generations. That's how we get it.
No, that's a great explanation. I think that might be pretty eye-opening to people that it's great to plant natives. It's great to plant a variety of plants, but there's even more you could do. And the reason behind it is very based in science. And I think some people, and I think that gets through to some people who are like, seeds, I could get them this way and that way. But it's a package of this genetic diversity that we need to keep going.
And as you just said, like it's maybe a kind of eye-opening moment and it was for me. Like when the first native plant seed activist, Heather McCargo, not necessarily she was the first, but she was the first one that explained it to me in a way that I went, oh my gosh, you're right. I hadn't ever thought about it. And that was like true over and over again in the research for this book, Marlene, was just how kind of, we talk about plant blindness, but I say, one of the things that was so apparent to me is that even as an accomplished gardener, even as a relatively well-informed plant person, there was so much I didn't know or didn't like really understand in a way that made me change my actions. And like I had epiphany after epiphany about this in terms of seed production and care in our world.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of all the ways in my world right now. It's like I propagate from seed when I can't find a certain variety, or we propagate from seed at work to see what interesting outcomes will be. But it's all for us. None of it is really or we can't propagate a plant another way and we, do it from seed. But it's never really for the purpose, I hate to say, for that reason. But I think that is sort of a game changer, thinking about it. It's like, okay, now if we could collect the seeds and start our natives and from it, I think that might be that should be on everyone's goal in a list to do. So you did mention, you were talking about indigenous cultures. And once again, it's sort of that, I hate to say, because I think we go through and we just assume we know that people know the importance of it from being in a plant background. But how is it so important for these cultures to continue those genetic traits? And do you have a number of how many have been just lost through time?
Oh gosh, no, I don't. But I'm sure it's larger than we want to actually. And probably more than we understand, even if we did a fairly large guess. I mean, but the point, like the bulk of your question there, why is this so important? I think that, again, as I was doing my research, one of the things that was apparent to me is that much of what I understood about seed was blindered by a very Western academic science perspective. and that I can learn about the biology of a seed. I can learn about the anatomy of a seed and how it hold the little fertilized ovule, the pollinated and fertilized ovule of a plant, forms, ripens, disperses from its parent plant and goes off into the world. And then it receives cues of light and heat and water, and it sends out its little, depth-seeking first root and its air and light-seeking first shoot with its little seed leaves. Like, I can understand the biology, but still, I can't get to what does seed really mean to us culturally, economically, spiritually. And so much, I think, of what we in this world right now are learning and remembering is that the indigenous mind, okay, I don't want to say that in such a categorical way, but the perspective of many land-based peoples around the globe across time have always incorporated the idea of ongoing care, that these other lives, other than human lives, whether they are insect or mammal or bird or plant, they are other equally important living beings. This, often referred to as an indigenous worldview, takes into account that these other lives have just as much importance as ours. They are not inert. They are not just to be taken advantage of, but they are to be learned from, related to, and respected as their own agents of growth and change and evolutionary understanding and knowledge. And so when you talk to, so right around the time that this book was going to print, or I had to turn it in, there was this beautiful piece in the New York Times about a big destructive wildfire in New Mexico. And one of the leading pictures of this was a woman, and I'm going to forget her name, but a woman of Indigenous and Hispanic descent who was evacuating. She works in water care and historic acequia preservation there in New Mexico. And the first thing she chose to put into her truck when evacuating in front of a fire was a large container of corn seed that had been passed down in her family for generations. And that right there gives you this other view of if a seed, if seeds and seed-bearing plants have been evolving and co-evolving with climate, with geology, with hydrology, but also with the care and relationship of the human hand, all these, 1 million or 2 million years that humans have been walking the planet with the plants, those seeds are encoded with all of the genetic information they need to survive based on climate, based on geology, based on all of the knowledge that has been bred into them over time. And so many Indigenous people that I interviewed for the book kept referring to this as kind of lessons and prayers from the ancestors to the present to take care of in order to move out into the future. And when you think about all of the information that, like, one acorn in our oak woodlands, Marlene, has had to carry with it in order to withstand fire, deer, drought, whatever it might be, like, they have figured out a lot of survival mechanisms that we have no idea of. And we, even our top research and scientists are still trying to figure out all of the mysteries of dormancy and germination and how to get different plants to do it or how they are doing it. And that is just, to me, one of those like goosebump moments of the mystery of life here.
And to me, it's when she's rescuing the seeds, she's not only rescuing what the plants themselves have done and the pressures put on them and the plant evolving with the weather and the climate, but also those were cultivated by her family for generations, and
Yeah.
what they went through, because I'm sure it was not easy at all
Mm-mm.
during certain times. So, and
Right.
they went through all the trouble of harvesting and growing, and for her to feel that responsibility
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
I need to save these.
These were the lives
Yes.
that allowed her ancestors to survive, right?
Yes.
Like there is a debt of
Mm-hmm.
gratitude and obligation, just like you say. And you think back to Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful kind of um economy of reciprocity, right? This is about giving and receiving with respect
Mm-hmm.
with these other lives that make our lives possible. And to see seed in that way, it just takes on this whole other dimension. And to listen to people of culture different than mine, kind of mashup of Irish, Scott, English, like I am not as immediately in contact with that kind of history in
Mm-hmm.
my own family, even knowing that I had gardening ancestors. No one passed me seeds of many, many, many generations. And so that was a whole new kind of perspective shift for me that was beautiful.
Yeah. No, I mean, I imagine it would be the equivalent of rescuing someone's diary. But in that
Yeah,
case, a lot of times if this was their livelihood and how they survived.
right.
So even
Yeah,
had
it's like
even more.
rescuing their grandmother.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier some groups that are working to sort of save some of these seeds from indigenous cultures. How are they doing that? Are they just putting the word out, or are they going in? I may imagine that's a big undertaking because there's so
I think
many
it's a
different
yeah.
cultures and groups.
Right. I think that in each tribal territory across North America, for sure, there are people who are at work saving, documenting the seeds. There are also, like the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, there are groups of people from all of those different tribes, or at least from some of those different tribes, who come together regularly
Mm,
to share not only seed, but seed knowledge, how you care for it, how you save it, how you store it, how you germinate it, how you make sure not to outbreed it if it's not planted properly
mhm.
when you are growing for the seed specifically. There are also, which I find just fascinating, many people, people of the African diaspora, people of the Asian diaspora, and of course, many indigenous tribal groups around the country who are sharing forward all the seed they can find with others in their group. So here in our area, there is a wonderful group called Namu Farm
Mhm.
and second generation seeds, and they are working to share seeds of the Asian diaspora with young people of Asian descent or new gardeners. They could be any age
Mhm.
of Asian descent, so that they reintroduce these seeds back to their people if there has been a disconnect in the diaspora and generations removed from
Mhm.
caring for land or plants, sometimes forcibly and
Yes.
terribly, right?
Yeah.
Like in the case of all of those diasporas, there have been terrible um, traumas and
Mhm.
atrocities committed to remove them from caring for their seed. Uh, the Native Seed Search is one such group down out of Tucson,
Okay.
Arizona. And it was started in the sort of 70s by a group of concerned ecologists who were seeing the loss of these tribal and native seeds of the area. And so they started to collect them and bank them and grow them out. And like many um, sort of groups have evolved in this last 5 to 10 years, Native Seed Search has kind of grown into a much more community-based, land-based seed care, protection, and saving organization within the people that those seeds actually come from. So instead of being kind of the oversight for the organization being people of outside the culture being in charge. It is now people from within the culture being in charge and setting the direction for how seeds are grown and cared for and which are collected and who they're shared out with. And I think that is a wonderful progress we're seeing in our world. And for instance, both second generation seeds, the one here on the West Coast specifically focused on seeds of the Asian diaspora and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, they are actively going to large organizations like the USDA Seed Bank out of Fort Collins, Colorado, or Seed Savers Exchange, or natural history museums around the country whose collections might include heritage seeds that have been just stored away in a box and nobody's looked at them again. These groups of these different cultural origins are working with these large institutions to find seed that should have been noted as culturally significant and return them to the culture that they originated from. It's a beautiful returning, and as Rowan White calls it, a rematriation of seed coming back into its appropriate community. And it's, in all of the things I studied that were so depressing and so sometimes horrifying and overwhelming, it was the stories of these kinds of seed keepers, not just cultural, but also environmental, or, like the Organic Seed Alliance being a watchdog in our commodity seed world for the better care of seed. It was these seed keepers that were the hope, and were kind of the human seed, if you will, trying to restore the way we philosophically and socioeconomically address seed in our world.
And for those, because I think we could distance ourselves and easily from this and say, oh yeah, from the indigenous people back in when colonization started. But if you look back just during the Japanese internment camps, they weren't able to take anything with them. And that was seed lost there, or just refugees coming in who can't take anything. So there's people alive today who sadly it stopped with them out of their, nothing they could control at all. So it's still happening. I mean, it's not like
still happening.
Yeah.
And these are all living cultures, right? These aren't like in the past used to be. These are living cultures at work today. And to see this rejuvenation and reconnection is just, it's powerful and hopeful.
And then of course, if people are wondering, well, why, I mean, it just benefits us all. It's that biodiversity. It's if in their culture, and if it's in their ethnic foods, they're going to grow it. They're going to continue to grow it, and then we're all better. We're all better off for that reason. The environment is, and that goes along with everything: the pollinators and beneficials and just everything. So it's just, but it is amazing to see these organizations working that way, and I can't imagine it's undertaking something so daunting, but it's so important. You mentioned one seed bank, and in your book, you mentioned, as people most heard, the Doomsday Vault, and then you were talking about the Millennium Seed Bank. How are those the same but also different? Like, what's the purpose of the Doomsday Vault? And explain that one a little bit for people who may not have heard of it. But with a name like Doomsday Vault, everyone's got to remember that.
It's such a terrible nickname, but the seed. So the way I sort of handled the book was, as different things came up in my own life, I would go to research them. So, the seeds are dispersing in my native seed shed. Like right now here in Northern California, the oaks are starting to drop their acorns. And I think to myself, what is the complete collection of dispersal mechanisms? And I talk about that in the book.
Yes,
or the seed catalogs start arriving, and I talk about that in the book.
I loved, as an antique collector, that got me when there's the collections of these old, I'm like, oh, if I could just find some of those at antique store. Sorry.
Yeah, no, the antique seed catalogs
Uh-huh.
and collections of them
Uh-huh.
held in institutions around the country. Like there's a great collection at the Smithsonian, there's a
Yeah.
great collection at the University of Oregon, there's a great collection at the Atlanta History Center's
Oh.
Cherokee Garden Library. And what's interesting about these is not only do they represent the history of seed growing, but they sometimes provide this cultural
Mm.
information, human cultural information that you and I were just talking about. But because we weren't looking at them for that kind of information previously, we didn't necessarily see it. But
Mhm.
like there is a wonderful scholar who I've had on my program a couple times, Abra Lee, who lives there in Atlanta. And she is regularly reviewing the historic seed catalogs,
Oh,
seed
how fun.
packages, seed company documents and papers from the Southeast to keep filling out information about Black farmers and gardeners, what they were doing, what they looked like, where they were, what they were growing. And she has been able to put together information that was lost to the
Mm.
written record, right? Like
Mhm.
nobody was
Yeah.
writing books about this in that time period, but she is able to put together a much more complete understanding of just how rich and abundant and prevalent, very avid and accomplished Black gardeners were in the Southeast throughout the 20th century. So that right there gives you a sense of like what
Yeah.
you can find in
That's
some of this information,
so
and it's seed information that's providing it.
that's
The
fascinating.
Yeah,
Love that.
it was again like this epiphany, like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, how interesting.
Yeah.
The seed banks were so interesting because, of course, we hear about them. And as you say, like we know some of their names, just they're part of our cultural literacy, if
Mhm.
you will. And the Millennium Seed Bank is one out of the United Kingdom. It is the Royal Horticultural Society at Kew Gardens Seed Bank, which they decided as of the year 2000, they put a ton of money into overhauling their current seed bank in order to try and meet a goal of seed banking all of the floral diversity of the United Kingdom. So that means collecting rare and ordinary plants via their seed from every ecosystem in the United Kingdom, all of its islands and associated countries. They're very close to their goal at this point. That is directly related to some of the earlier seed banks in the world. The first known kind of government led seed bank or official, what people called a seed bank, was in Russia in the late 1800s. And that's the Vavilov Institute. And the goal of that was to collect and save the genetic seeds of all of the best food crops in
Mhm.
that country and geographic region so that the government always had a backup store if they ran into a food security issue, which, of course, food security is national security.
Mhm.
And it is not unusual in times of war or empire building or just bad human behavior generally, that people will destroy other people's food in order to control them. So, a seed bank of your food crops provides you with some security that you can plant again, you can harvest again, you can feed your people well again. That was the point of that first seed bank. And it was the point of many seed banks up until the late 20th century when you started to see things like the USDA's big seed bank backup bank there in Fort Collins, which is a backup copy of different regional seed banks across the US that then send a backup copy to Fort Collins. That is focusing not just on food and crops or seed of economically important plants, but also now starting to collect native plant and biodiversity
Okay.
representation from around North America.
Okay. So
That
they
was a
are
lot. Yeah, that was sort of a lot to give you all at once. But did that make sense? Do you have another
Yeah,
question? And then I'll move to the doomsday.
no, I think what's fascinating is when most people think of a seed bank, they may think only of food. But now we're realizing we need to save the biodiversity of these quote unquote ornamental plants, but natives, because what's the point of, if it gets so bad that we have to go into the doomsday vault to get seed for food, we don't have the environment to even sustain life for us.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, all of our food has been developed from our native plant genetics. Like all of our food crops have a wild progenitor that they were derived from, whether it's wheat out of the Fertile Crescent, which there were, hundreds of species, whether it's beans out of South America, squashes out of South America, potatoes from Peru, each food crop that we think of today has a center of biodiversity of its origin place. And that has been collectively adapted over human culture and time into what we think of as our food crops.
Yeah.
And so it's not that they're separate. They have always been connected. We just had that connection kind of erased for us for some time.
Exactly.
And I think it's an important connection that we make. But also, as you say, more and more seed banks are focusing, like the California Botanic Garden down in Southern California, they are specifically focused on the native seeds of the biodiversity of the California floristic province, specifically so that if we lose something important, like in a very terrible fire, Marlene, we have the seed from that exact area of those exact species that we can hand back to that region and say, work on restoration. Like it's not lost, just this, you can use this to help restore. And that is a phenomenal security in these times. I mean, you just think about the fires of the areas of the state of California just since 2018 or 2017, when we've had, a couple of very hard fire years in there. And we don't want to think that there are native plants or rare plants in there that we can't restore. And these seed banks allow for that. So the Doomsday Vault, which is the biggest seed bank in the world, which is up about 1,300 miles north of the Arctic Circle on an island in the Svalbard archipelago. It is a backup copy of every other seed bank, from Seed Savers Exchange to the USDA to the Millennium Seed Bank to the areas of biodiversity for dryland crops that was in Aleppo and is now in Morocco and Libya separately because the seed bank in Aleppo was lost. It is a backup copy of all of these kinds of seed in one place. And it was a phenomenal, if you will, choreography and collaboration of very difficult bureaucracies sometimes actually coming together to make it happen. And it's overseen by the Norwegian government and a large multinational nonprofit called the Crop Trust. And that is the point of the seed bank up there, sometimes known as the Doomsday Vault, so that if everything was lost, we have the seed genetics to restore as much as we can possibly restore.
Yeah. So I think people have heard of that one, but it's nice to know that there's so many others, because I think people really probably think that's the only one out there. That's
right.
It. Yeah.
And there's something like, I want to say the last number I heard was there are between 1,500 and 1,800 different seed banks of varying size, but with these sort of global interests around the world right now.
And you mentioned about the California native one, and it's so realistic, and it's already happened.
Yeah.
I'm sure is that these fires, when you're talking about a native plant that's endemic to a very small area and it's already burned. I mean, it's sad to think that we've already lost, just from the fires recently.
Right.
Because this is happening. It's not like, doomsday. I mean, it's the fires we've had in California have been devastating.
Right. And you think about the earthquake in Morocco and the flooding in Libya and the hurricane on the, it's all happening.
Yeah.
Like these
Yeah.
And we need this seed, and to have it sent back out into place to restore and then replenished and sent back to the seed banks. It's an elegant and beautiful idea.
Yeah. And it just, I have this picture where everyone, all the countries were like, stopping their wars. And I mean, it's just in my head. They're like, oh yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and give seeds here in case it's doomsday. Okay, let's just continue building nuclear weapons.
Right.
It's this weird,
Right. Like
weird.
the fact that it happened is a miracle, but
Yeah.
it is also kind of that miracle of seed. Like you
Yeah.
think about how intelligent the design is of a plant to produce seed for all kinds of variations on what could happen. There's enough for the birds to eat and enough for regeneration and enough to just be lost because they landed in the wrong spot. Like it's miraculous when you really think about it. And as you said right in the very beginning, it's all around us all the time, but we take it for granted. And to re-see it and reappreciate it is this wonderful access point into being more intentional ourselves in what we buy, who we support, how we even just see the native plant environments around us and remember how complex and fabulous they are.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really liked about your book is you took went through a year, if I'm not mistaken, and you had your personal observations. And it's almost like we were looking at the seeds with you, and it just reminded me how I don't stop enough to take a look at the intricacies of the seeds and the plants. And I do, I teach it to students and kids who come through, and we do a whole seed dispersal mechanism. But it's the big showy ones like, oh, here's a coconut and here's a loofah and the ballistic seeds, which are fabulous.
Best.
And if it gets them into realizing how seeds get dispersed, that's great. Here's chocolate, and vanilla. And so that's great. But it's just even the most, quote, mundane plants around us have phenomenal seed dispersal mechanisms, growth of how to get that seed out and about. So I like that part of your book where it was just sort of like, just take the time to look at it, especially the native seeds and what's going on there. What do you hope that people come away from reading the book? Like, what
right
can
there,
they do?
you just said it for me, right? It's just try and look like when people say, well, what can I do? And I think that very first one is get to know the seeds of your area. Just when I read the statistic that, a large majority of graduating high school seniors couldn't identify the seed on many of the plants around them. I was like, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is just like reassert this as an important part of our own cultural literacy, how plants produce seed and how beautiful and amazing that is. So just reacquaint yourself, if you can, with and pay attention to what plants in your garden or in your, natural landscapes or parks, what does their seed look like? When does it come on? When it falls, what does it do? And then the second, the second takeaway, I hope, is that people think a lot more about things like the Farm Bill, or, like we just had a bill here in California get stalled in Congress or in the Senate about requiring that all commercial development going forward include something like 80% native plants in the landscaping. And that stalled, which is, I think, a great disappointment. But I think we often think, oh, well, how does that actually affect me or relate to me? And it's all what we were just talking about. And then just like, try and grow some of your own plants from seed and see how it goes and see how it feels. Like to see your flowers bloom from starting with seed is one of the great gratifying, seeds like flowers or vegetables or a plant you're going to put in your native plant garden. Anything you grow from seed yourself is so much more gratifying even than a plant you buy at the nursery and put out there.
I was on a podcast and they're like, well, what do you still like about gardening? What do you like about gardening? I literally said, every time I plant tomato seeds, I'm still amazed they come up. I still plant too many because I'm like, no, none of them are going to come up. And when they come up, I'm still absolutely amazed that they come up. And so I said, when that gets old, that's maybe when I'll stop gardening, but I don't think that's ever going to get old.
It has never gotten old for me.
Yeah. We just planted 20-year-old, this South African tree seed at work that someone had in storage. And we're all excited because some of them are coming up and we're like, this is amazing. So
it is amazing.
It is amazing. So it's like, wow, these seeds have been sitting here for like 20 years. 20 years and they're coming up, just waiting to come up. And I'm looking at them. I'm like, your time's now, seeds.
Your time is now. I love it. The miracle of life.
Yes.
But
no, I mean, I think
it just reminds us we are so small, but we have so much impact. We have to start where we are. And starting with a seed is a great place to start.
Well, thank you so much. Where can people, I know your podcast, Cultivating Place, and is that on most major platforms?
Yep. And wherever you get your podcasts. And the same is true for the book, wherever you get your books. And if you order one in a place that's not my website, which is great, it's fine, buy it wherever you can. And I think the audio version goes on sale tomorrow and the, e-reader version as well. But if you send me an email, cultivatingplace@gmail.com, I'm happy to send you a signed book plate specific to what we sow.
Oh, wow.
But it should be available everywhere.
Yeah, and your website is cultivatingplace.com.
It is.
And on you're on all the Instagrams, Cultivating Place.
Yes, it's on Instagram. I'm cultivating_place.
Okay.
And that's really my social media platform of preference. I just get overwhelmed by the others.
Yeah, I always ask people, I'm like, and do you have a TikTok?
No TikTok, no YouTube. I'm sorry.
I know. It's like, how thin do you want me stretched? It could be.
Thank you, Marlene. It's been great.
So
I so appreciate it.
All right. Until next time, everyone. Happy gardening.